Hi everyone, I'm Matt Koss, host of The Wandering Screen on YouTube and awards editor at Awards Focus. I'm so thrilled to be here for this special conversation spotlighting three extraordinary cinematographers and their Emmy-submitted episodes. So let's meet them. First, we have Hilary Spera, cinematographer of Daredevil Born Again, and we're discussing episode 8, Isle of Joy. We also have cinematographer Chris Teague of The Acolyte, and we're looking at episode 4 titled Day. And we have cinematographer Johanna Coelho of The Pitt, and we'll be diving into episode 7 p.m. Each of our panelists has helped shape some of the most talked about series of the year, so let's jump right in. Welcome, everyone. Hilary, I wanted to start with you about Daredevil because it's been 6 years since the first series had its last episode. How did the visual language change from the first series to Daredevil Born Again?
Yeah, we definitely, we're all huge fans of the original show on our show. And so the biggest goal was sort of just to bring it forward into sort of like a, really contemporary place since it does take place, 6 or 8 years later. So we really just wanted to sort of like kind of evolve it a little bit cinematically. We went 239 as opposed to 16:9 if they shot the original show, and we shot anamorphic and just sort of found ways to kind of bring it forward but still maintain a lot of the spirit of the original show and a lot of the texture of it. Yeah,
can you talk about how that anamorphic style helped to make New York a character?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest challenges and sort of my favorite part of making the show was maintaining New York as a character so deeply. I mean, it's a street level show. Obviously, it takes place in New York from the comic book, and just sort of having that texture and just ability to sort of maintain what New York is in the show was huge. And we shot it very practically. Like a lot of the stunts were practical. There's a lot of practical effects. There's very little VFX in the show, actually. So doing that while on the streets of New York is just like was a really fun challenge. And I thought the anamorphic frame really lent itself to kind of showing the city. A lot of the lines and sort of like the compositions were sort of like accentuated by just that anamorphic frame. So we were lucky to be able to do that. And I think it brought a lot to sort of just the scope and the scale of telling the story in New York.
Yeah. And what sort of challenges did having those practical sets make for you when shooting this season?
All kinds of great challenges. I mean, Chris knows we both came up in New York, and shooting there is definitely a challenge, but I sort of think that it's a really unique thing to be able to shoot in those places where they're so one of a kind. And, I live in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which is a very specific waterfront area of Brooklyn. It's very textured. It's very warehousey and kind of, cobblestone streets and stuff. And Red Hook played for itself in the show. So it was a really unique thing to be able to show New York and it's like true dusty corners, and it's New Yorkers don't really care if you're shooting a TV show on the street. They're kind of just like, the story the directors always tell is we were shooting this scene where Daredevil's walking down the street and some guy just walked by and said, "Hey Daredevil, what's up?" Like people just don't even care. They're just doing their thing, and it's definitely not a spectacle. So yeah, it was fun.
It's very different than Los Angeles, where it's an inconvenience if you see a
Right.
film truck.
Yeah.
But what I loved about the season as well, and especially this episode, is the framing difference between Fisk and Matt. Can you talk a bit about how you approached those two characters?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a distinctive choice there in trying to make, Fisk's world is very institutionalized and it's very controlled, and he's so much larger than life. And so the idea was to always shoot him with a very wide angle lens, close up and always very low, and sort of showing him and his stature kind of as big as possible. And Matt and Daredevil's side of the world was very humanistic. It was often handheld and it was a longer lensing and just sort of feeling more kind of with his character as opposed to sort of just like putting him in a very kind of like controlled environment. It was always about like kind of letting it feel a little looser. And Fisk was almost always center punched and very center framed. And it was the opposite for Daredevil's world. There was a lot of more like naturalism and sort of warmer light and stuff like that in that storytelling. It was meant to be very separate. And when the two met actually in scenes where they interacted, we stayed true to that language and shot Matt's side handheld and Fisk's side studio and usually a very composed.
Yeah, the black and white ball is so fantastic to watch and it's so immersive, especially the one take, and there's so many different characters that come into frame within a single take, and then it seemed like you were zooming in further and further into the depth of the room. Can you talk a bit about achieving that?
Yeah, sort of. It was interesting because, I mean, it's sort of a strange reference, but our reference was certainly Altman films, in the way that he's able to sort of tell a story within one long, often a long zoom shot or a camera move. And so we had a tremendous amount of dialogue to shoot in that location. And, for a TV show to all take place in kind of, for the majority of the episode in one location, our challenge was just to how to shoot it in a way that didn't get boring and also tell this a lot of storytelling and within the same room. And so we chose to do it through long zooms and camera moves that would kind of show off different pockets of conversation as it moved through the room. And then that later was sort of mirrored in the what we called our sensory grande, which was sort of the Daredevil sensory moment, which again is like a dolly zoom combined with a long zoom and sort of showing how he's able to sense the whole room and environment. So in some ways it was meant to feel claustrophobic, and in others it was meant to sort of feel like, they're all so linked, even if they're not in the same part of the room at the same time.
Yeah, I really love that moment as well when Bullseye is lining up his gun down to Fisk. Can you talk about the perspectives, like changing the perspectives? And also, you're working with a lot of extras in that scene. What was that like?
Yeah, it was a lot of people, and we sort of had these like dance breaks every time we call cut. We just sort of just let the crowd just shake it off a little bit, because it was just being within that space for long period of time was people got a little stir crazy. But yeah, it was a big challenge. I mean, it was a huge challenge for the AD team as well to sort of maintain that. And we were doing practical stunts, like the actual gunshot is squib and practical as opposed to VFX. And so it's just a lot of moving parts. And we scouted and planned that location kind of around that camera move, where we needed to show him in the balcony. We need to show the threat of where that was, and also how all of their storylines were all kind of culminating in this climax at that one moment. So it was definitely, it was a really cool script for that episode, and the big challenges were sort of how to show it in a way that felt dangerous and exciting, but also, could really bang out a lot of the story.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into a conversation with Chris as well, because you were, Hillary, just talking about the convergence of storylines. And in the Acolyte, in the 4th episode, we're starting to see the twins starting to get closer and closer together. And please don't quiz me on Star Wars lore, because I will not impress anyone.
Don't quiz me either, please.
But Chris, I want to start with what those first conversations were with series creator Leslie Headland about the visual language of the Acolyte, because it is set 100 years before the first movies of Star Wars.
Leslie and I are good friends. We go way back. We did Russian Doll together. I've worked with her partner, Rebecca Henderson, on other projects. So, and we live in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn. And so when things move forward, I remember we had this long walk around Prospect Park where she just kind of downloaded on me like everything she'd been thinking about, because she had been developing the show for 5 years. Obviously you're walking into a universe that's been very well established and has had so many movies and series made about it, and I'm sure Hillary dealt with this as well. Is like, how do you exist within this framework, but how do you kind of establish your own language? And Leslie was very interested in bringing elements of Chinese martial arts films into the show. She felt like there was like a young adult component to it, and there's just all these kind of disparate ideas that she started to kind of download on me, and we do this thing where she throws a lot of stuff my way, whether it's just ideas or things she's been thinking about, story points, or it's references to movies, and then I kind of reflect back on her, and I think, well, this is what that all sounds like to me, and I start to kind of like take all she's given to me and distill it into a maybe more like concrete framework that turned into this kind of Bible of how we were going to shoot the show. What the camera movement was, what was going to dictate the camera movement, what the kind of color palette would feel like, all those disparate elements. And so it was a really fun collaborative experience, because it's like her brain works in a very different way than my brain, but there's a lot of overlap, and she just has like amazing taste and is this incredible writer, but she also has like really phenomenal understanding of filmmaking. So it was a very cool process.
So when you're building practical sets for the show, how are you starting to visualize where the choreography would sit within a scene?
I mean, honestly, I think that's one of the most difficult things to deal with in that show is that you don't get to just kind of scout a location and kind of place the scene within that location. You kind of have to imagine it from the ground up, or you imagine it based on a drawing, the first draft of a drawing that the production designer's team, offers to you. It takes a lot of creativity, a lot of visualization. But then on the other hand, there were certain sequences, like the big fight sequence in the opening episode of the show, where we had a phenomenal amount of like very high tech tools, where we had a 3D model of the set, and we had our fight choreography team motion capture the stunt performers doing the this extensive fight sequence, and then we were able to literally like put the motion capture fight choreography into the 3D set and actually see how it was going to play, and kind of what lenses we might need to be on from shot to shot, or we could virtually reshoot the scene, so by the time we ended up shooting that particular scene, we had a very clear map and a very clear understanding of what the sequence was going to look like, and then on set it was basically capturing what we had planned with some improvements along the way, like every little iteration that we could find to kind of make things look a little bit more dynamic, make the action just a little bit more powerful, which with the pace of a TV show like that was very time consuming, and that was from the very beginning of a prep period. We thought like this fight sequence is going to be the thing that's like going to define the show for everybody, so we're going to put all our eggs in that basket. But then you get into episode 4 and 5. 5 has numerous fight sequences in it, and it became much more old school, where we're looking at the choreography in an empty stage with a bunch of mats, and then we're talking it through, and we're seeing where we think the camera's going to be, and then the fight and stunt team are just shooting it on handy cams and kind of like cobbling it together, and we're kind of like finding it as we go. So it was a lot of different iterations of, or versions of, like how you might try to visualize and capture that kind of thing.
Yeah, it sounds very complicated, but it also, when watching it, looks seamless too. And what I really loved in this episode is the look of the forest, and I believe it's called Kofar.
That's right.
And just talking about depth with Hillary, like the depth of the mountains as it goes in the frame. I wish that I'd been watching it in a cinema because it was so stunning. Can you talk a bit about the look of that forest, where that came from, and was that also painted?
There's a location component to the Kofar planet, which was shot on Madeira, which is an island in Portugal, which we had scouted, but we actually filmed that last. So it was all the stage work, which is everything that takes place within the forest, that we did first. And Dagobah from Empire Strikes Back was a huge reference point for that. And we had a lot of conversations about how we create this forest that's supposed to feel very overwhelming and claustrophobic, and where the canopy is hundreds and hundreds of feet high, how to create lighting that feels realistic to a space like that, and how to stage almost 2 episodes of television within this space, which it was the biggest set I had ever worked on. It's about as big as a football field. It was enormous, but once you start filling it with both real plants, real greens, and these incredible like foam manufactured trees, it starts to get really small really fast, and you realize like it's going to be a real challenge to try to convey the sense of these people traveling miles and miles through this forest in 100 yards of a football field. So we had to kind of use every trick in the book in terms of like seating angles and moving set around to kind of make it look different. And I mean, we also had the benefit of the first episode of that kind of planet taking place mostly during the daytime, and the second episode taking place during the night. So we had this great built-in visual shift that happens that allowed us to allowed us to keep the viewer from getting bored of seeing what feels like the same thing all the time.
And speaking of the same thing, I think this is maybe a segue into Johanna now to talk about episode 13, because we're in this hospital environment in the Pitt for 15 episodes. So, Johanna, what was your approach to episode 13, and how was it different than the episodes that had come before it?
Yeah, so, for all the episodes before 13, basically, we are in the hospital in this environment that we're just following the shift of doctors, and we really immersed in their journey and the way, it doesn't stop for them as they're going through patient to patient. What happens in 13 with the mass casualty event, which starts actually in episode 12, they suddenly get, a massive amount of people that needs to have intense treatment right away. And they all get brought in the middle of the stage of the ER. They don't put anyone in the rooms anymore. They just get everyone in the bed in the middle so they can keep tracking everyone with their wounds and treat them as fast as possible. So, it becomes kind of a different setup in the way we were shooting before on the other episodes, because before the central station, the middle of the ER is more clear. There's still some gurneys here and there on the side of it, but basically, the doctors walk around, have the conversation, and then they go in the room, and then they go see the next patient, etc. But now everyone is in the same space in the middle, and it's just full of gurneys everywhere, and they're all wearing these white gowns with bloods on them, and it's basically about them moving from patient to patient in the gurneys in the central and some of the hallways as well. And also, keeping track of them, going back to check on them, but also giving signals to each other while all of this is happening. So the way we had to shoot this episode was a little different, because now it's not only a choreography of moving through the space. It's how do we keep moving through the space with no more space, basically. It is what it is, because there was barely any gaps at this point, since all the gurneys are there, everything is filled, and there's so many doctors and patients and nurses in the same space. So the show itself is already, a really big choreography between every single department to make this move works and to make the storyline progress. But, in this situation, it was even harder to work with everyone because there's really no space to move through, and the camera has to stay in the middle of the action, and it has to move through all the gurneys and then follow tracks of who's where and when. They all look the same because they're all wearing these white gowns with blood on them, and so you want to make sure you keep following the story and who do you look at and when. And I think that was the biggest challenge on this episode. It was really keeping track, making you feel like we keep moving with them, but it's a much tighter space in the way that there's no more gaps really for the cameras to go through.
Yeah, it's amazing because it never feels like whiplash when you're jumping between characters and patients and gurneys rolling by, and it's a very highly emotional episode too. And I wanted to ask, because you're also the sole cinematographer on the show, what was it like, in the beginning stages in the pre-production to create this environment, knowing the episodes that were coming and knowing that the actors would have to interact with everything that's going to be there?
Yes, so when I was actually even interviewing for the project, I already knew that the goal of this show was to be able to move everywhere and to see everywhere. So a 360 set, basically, right? Yeah. And so when I came in, when I got hired on the project, the set was designed and it was starting in construction, but I came in on time, obviously, to do all the layout of the lighting with my gaffer and really plan out how can we make this set work as a 360. And, so really the planning of picking the right lights with the right CRI, the placement of them. Obviously we knew it was white walls. That helps a lot for bouncing the light back from the ceiling, because we don't really have any lights on the side walls and we have absolutely no lighting on stands or anything on the ground. It just, wouldn't work. So, the walls that are white, we picked the color of the white with the production designer. We did a lot of testing on what shade of white we wanted, because we have a full diversity of cast. So it was very important because it bounces back light. What is the color of white that's going to look good on every skin tone? Because we really wanted every skin tone to look realistic. The shine of it, was really effective as well in the lighting. And then, all the contours, a lot of things are actually white. Now, the challenge is you have a full white set and you want to make sure that it doesn't look too much too, right? You want to have this balance between it's bright, it's intense, it's an ER, but it's still cinematic and you still can follow the story without just looking at the walls. So that was kind of a balance we had to find with the production designer on the type of white, the shine, but also the levels we did with lighting on the cans on the side of the walls, etc., etc. So yeah, the design of the 360 set was a big challenge because we, until we saw it, the first episode, we were not sure how well it was going to work or not. And that's always the stressful part, I had never been in a situation like this where you fully have to, let the camera move a 360 completely in the shot and have every single skin tone lit properly and, correctly and accurate. We do have some tools, we use to help that process. We had some custom-made onboard lights on the matte box. We also have a dot dash on the pole following. So this is kind of the moving lighting that comes with us just to help out. But on episode 13, because they're wearing the white gowns and the glasses, because in trauma, it's a trauma mode, we actually couldn't use this because you would reflect everything in the glasses nonstop. So we actually really went real 360 set at that moment. With the lighting, nothing really following with them. But yeah, basically, it was really about finding out the best way we could create this move, following through with, you can see absolutely everywhere and not any, there's no walls moving. Everything you see on set is how it is. It doesn't move except anything that's on wheels. So the challenge too was to be able to create this move that can pass through between background, gurneys and walls, because absolutely nothing moves in the set. And the reason for that is because we really wanted to recreate that documentary feeling. So the rule was we should be able to shoot it the way we would shoot it in an ELR. And that's why we didn't want to move any walls.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about movement here, but there's also scenes in the episode that are just between two characters and they're no longer moving anymore, whether it's one of the doctors and her son, or between Robbie and Jake during their conversations towards the end of the episode. How do you approach those slower, more human moments and capturing especially the heightened emotions of the scene?
Yeah, I think it's the way the camera can get really even closer. We follow them really close and we're in the middle of it, but it's the way, we can really get even closer to them and kind of isolate them from everything that's happening around. We're shooting full frame, and that really helps out that feeling, that kind of disappearance when you get so close to the character. We mostly use actually 2 primes on the show. We use the 50 for mostly all the shot following, but when we get in very intense emotions, we do put on the 75, which isolate them even more. And that's what we did when Dr. Robbie realized that Leia is dead. So that lens actually completely isolate them from everyone else, and you understand that it comes into realization of it.
I want to open up the discussion for everyone, but I want to start with you, Johanna, because I was reading in my research that you've called the role of a director of photography that they're a visual psychologist. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit of that, what that means, and Chris and Hillary, how you relate to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually a term I've been using since the beginning of my career. I just think there's so much relation on how much we have to analyze characters and understand them to be able to visually transmit their emotion and what they're going through, right? So it's kind of a therapy we're doing visually. We have to get into their head and visually bring that. So I always thought, cinematographers were kind of visual psychologists, and that's why I created that term.
Yeah. Hillary, does that stand true for you too? And Chris, how does that work for you also with capturing the emotions of a character? Because you also come from a lot of comedy experience as well.
I think I don't know, I guess the more you read and attach yourself to stories, the more of a sense of intuition you get about how something should feel. And if you kind of have a sense of how it might want to feel, then that translates into what it might need to look like. I guess I don't know. I like the process, the way that we do a lot of talking about how something should look and feel like, and breaking things down and looking at references, but then we sort of get put in these really high pressure situations where we have to make decisions very quickly. And I think then you start to rely more on your intuition and just kind of reacting to what's happening in the moment. I mean, I love how when you do, you do all this shot listing or all these overhead plans or whatever, but nothing prepares you for when you see that blocking rehearsal the first time and you see that actor do something that you never expected that they were going to do, and then that something like clicks in your brain about, well, we need to be like right there when that happens, and so that changes what we were thinking, and it gets real exciting again, right? Because you're not just checking shots off your shot list, you're kind of now you're designing something, you're reacting to what's happening in front of you.
Yeah. And as cinematographers, you're all heads of departments, and there's so many different heads of departments within the crew. How do you find your collaborations, especially on these shows, with the other heads of departments? And what are the things that you like to do to start building the relationship when you join a project?
Well, I'll start, I guess. So I think for me, it's very interesting with overhead department to, first of all, understand how they approach the department, because everyone has a different way to work. And I think it's very important on each project to adapt to new person and new personalities. So I really like to understand, see at the limit, how much collaboration do they want to bring towards you, especially with production designers, actually. I think it's so important. And, on a show like this, I think it just goes hand to hand, but, you want to make sure you let them come to you as well with anything for set questions they have, and they'll do that naturally. So then you'll be involved in all this process as well. So I think for me, it's really observing first what the person is like, and then really making sure, we can find the right way to all collaborate on that project and bring it up together.
Yeah, I mean, I think you start from a place of trust, right? We all, if we're all coming out of this project together. If I hired you on, it's because I trust you and I like where you're coming from. But then if it's people you haven't worked with before, there's always this learning process, right? And you get to know the way other department heads like to work. Some gaffers have a lot of ideas about lighting. Some gaffers are incredible at running a team and prepping a set and getting everything, all the pieces there, but aren't necessarily going to jump in when it comes to creative ideas. And that's okay too. I mean, it's about getting to know where people's strengths lie and giving them the room to kind of run and be creative and take ownership, because I think whenever you do that, you'll get the best work out of people and people will be the most satisfied, and your set's going to be a better place to come to work.
Yeah. And within the TV space, there's so many shows being made these days. What advice would you give to emerging cinematographers trying to break into the industry?
I think, it's be willing to try new things, don't try to get stuck in one genre or anything like that. Be willing to try new things also on the side of it that could bring you a TV project. Test, your abilities also to run something a little bigger as a team leader as well. It's very important. And really go to meetings, meet more people. You never know who are the person you're going to meet that are going to end on the TV show and recommend you. I think that's just a spider web, the industry, and you're just going to give yourself the best chances. But I don't know if there's a formula, to be honest. I think really it's about being at the right place at the right time. And so for that to happen, I think you just go as many places as you can,
Yeah, I mean, I go ahead, Hillary. And I think, that being willing to, I guess it's similar to what Joanna was saying, like being willing to take work that might not be like the obvious choice for you, that isn't exactly what you were looking for, because I mean, you learn something on everything that you do, and you meet a whole new group of people on every show that you work on, and that can hopefully only lead to other opportunities.
Yeah, and it's
and I think on that actually is matching with what Hilary was saying is, the more projects you do, the more experience you have, the more you will trust yourself. So it's all like going together, right? And then you get that confidence that will lead you to these projects.
Exactly. Practice makes perfect. The more you do it. But I want to leave you guys with one last question. And, you've all worked on this first season of the show that you've worked on. And I wanted to ask, what was your biggest takeaway from that season that you're taking with you into the rest of your career?
I think
for me, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, sorry. I think my biggest thing I'm learning in general is like how to let go, like how to not obsess about things, and I think learning how to let go is about learning how to focus on what's actually important. I mean, you can spend a lot of time on set in our position changing things or perfecting things, and you start to realize like and your crew who's super eager may want to perfect things as much as they possibly can, and you have to be the person who says, I don't want to spend the 10 minutes getting rid of that shadow because I want that 10 minutes for the next scene. I want that 10 minutes for when I really need it, when it's going to change something that I think is really going to make a difference. Because there you can't do all the things you might possibly want to do and improve upon on set. So you have to know how to kind of pick your battles. And it's taken me a long time to kind of like get to that point, I think.
I think for me, it's learning that to be willing and not afraid to do things differently. Because for the Pitt, for example, I've never shot that way. I've never worked that way. And, when we tell you get in a project with white walls everywhere and, you're not going to have any marks on set and it's all handheld and you're going to see everywhere. I've honestly never worked.
That's a terrifying way to work.
It's terrifying, it's all handheld. We do not carry tripods on our trucks. Just, we do not have tripods. So, I think I embraced it and I made the best out of it, like how to work within this condition. And I think what I learned about it, it's good to do things that makes you uncomfortable and use them at your advantage and learn new things with that. And I learned a lot from, I kind of enjoy working with white walls right now. I'm not gonna lie. I love it, you know, and I don't know if I felt that way before. And I think that's what I learned about the show. Embrace things that might be different from what you used to.
Well, I mean, the passion that you all have for your projects and for the craft itself is really amazing. And I really appreciate the insights into all of your shows and the artistry and a peek behind the lens, so to speak. So thank you for joining today. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for
Thank
having
you.
me.